On this week's episode of What the Ship, we talk about the Panama Canal and the drought impacting shipping. We discuss the container sector. We look at how wildfires are affecting shipping around the world. Then we talk about grain, oil, and coal in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. And finally, we ask, who rules the seas? Hi, I'm Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this week's What the Ship. So, we didn't have an episode last week. I apologize about that. Start of school back here at Campbell University gets really busy. Plus, we had a whole batch of short little stories that came out last week. But we're back on track with our weekly What the Ship. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our first story. Story number one takes us to the Panama Canal. We were just at the Suez Canal with a collision that happened during that passage. So if you didn't check out that video, please do. A really interesting event unfolded in the Suez Canal recently. But I want to talk about the Panama Canal today because a lot of issues in the context of the Panama Canal. This is marine traffic showing you the backup on both the northbound side and the southbound side of the Panama Canal. Up here on the north, this is the Atlantic Ocean, and the south side, this is the Pacific Ocean. Not exactly, but that's basically where they link to. And what we're seeing is these long backups at the canal. And the reason for the backups has to do with water. This is the Gatun Lake water level. Now, the Panama Canal, if you ever want to read the best book on this, it's David McCullough's Path Between Two Seas. Fantastic book on the construction and building of the Panama Canal. But the Panama Canal is fed by a freshwater lake. They dam up these series of tributaries and create Gatun Lake. And fresh water is used into the locks, and they eventually spill into the north and south ends of the canal. So you've got to have a huge amount of fresh water. Problem you have right now is Gatun Lake is really low. You see it right here, August 23rd, 79.7 feet. That has basically restricted the draft of vessels that can use the big lane of the Panama Canal, called the Neo-Panamax lane, down to 44 feet. It's usually 50 feet. So you're seeing a 6-foot reduction there. Panamax, it's not really impacting at all. But what you see here is where the water levels are, and the prospective projections have water levels going back up late September into October. If you scroll down here and look at the historic levels, in August, we should be at about 85 feet. Again, we're at 79 feet. That is a big problem, which means that we're seeing restrictions being implemented on the Panama Canal, which we're going to talk about. This is the wait time on the Panama Canal. This is from Waterfront Maritime Services. This is their publication they put out. On the Panama Canal, they show you the number of vessels that are booked to go through the canal and those that are not booked. So here are the vessels that are in the queue waiting: 45 booked vessels, 75 non-booked vessels. If you're a Neo-Panamax vessel heading from the Pacific to the Atlantic, you get a 6 to 7 day wait. 4 to 5 days coming the other way. But when you start getting into the other areas, the super area and the regulars, you're seeing delays of almost 2 weeks. And in particularly where we're seeing that is in LNGs, tankers, and bulkers coming through. Those are the ones that are having the biggest problem. This article by Greg Miller over in FreightWaves, strongly recommend. Fantastic article. Greg is always a great wonk when it comes to data, and there's no shortage of it in this article. He talks about how the shipping traffic jam at the Panama Canal is not a crisis yet, which is key. It is not a crisis yet. If you start looking at it, which Greg does, he breaks it down. So one of the things you're looking at is the average number of daily transits. The Panama Canal has announced that it's reducing the number of transits down from 40 down to about 32 to 34, depending on the day. Not really impacting the Neo-Panamax vessels. The vessels that are getting impacted right now are the Panamax vessels. These are the vessels that use the old lanes of the Panama Canal. The original canal, built in 1914, has a series of 6 locks. Those locks have a set dimension. You can't exceed those dimensions. Can't be more than 895 feet long, 105 foot wide, and a draft of about 35 feet. The Neo-Panamax lane is the one that was designed in 2004, went into operation in 2016, much larger dimensions. Those transits seem not to be affected greatly. If you look at the chart here, you're looking back in July of 2021, 9.1 Neo-Panamax transits daily. It's up to 9.9 right now. But where you're seeing the decrease is in the Panamax lanes, and there's a good reason for this. The Neo-Panamax lanes actually has a water capture system that captures about 80% of the water that comes out of Gatun Lake and recycles it. The old locks don't. And so that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this happen right now. Greg also included this chart, which I think is an extremely important chart. It shows you the waiting time in days for certain vessels. And the ones to note are the red. Those are container ships. Container ships are almost not waiting at all. They're able to get through. Now, what we are seeing with container ships, and we saw a story from G Captain about this, Mike Schuller did a great story on this. When the Evermax went through the Panama Canal not too long ago, this Neo-Panamax vessel, it had offloaded almost 1,300 containers to get its draft up so it can go through the canal. Those containers were then railed across the isthmus and then loaded back on the vessel. So while you didn't have a delay in getting through the canal, you did have a delay in that the cargo had to be offloaded and then reloaded on the other side. Where you're seeing the delay right now are in liquefied petroleum gas carriers right here, the green line, and you're seeing it in dry bulk, the blue line right here. This is where you're seeing that happen. Those are the areas where we're seeing the greatest impact. And this chart does it in bulk commodities. So you look at crude and oil production tankers. Down at the bottom, the gray is the LPG tankers, and then the red are the dry bulk carriers. This is where you're seeing the greatest amount of delays right now. So, circling back to Greg's story, what canal constraints mean to U.S. containerized imports? Well, he says it right here. It has an effect because it means you can load less on the ship, says Rolf Haben Jensen, CEO of Hauppauge Line. The effect is not immaterial, but it's also not huge. So ships are loading fewer boxes or having to take them on and off, but they're getting through. There really isn't a huge one. If you look at what a SP Global carrier source says, no issues on the U.S. coast with Panama, no impact on schedules. So container ship traffic, most of which moves via scheduled transits booked well ahead of time and given priority over other vessels, have seen delays and added costs, but did not face significant disruptions. So on the container side, you're not seeing it. But when you look at energy and agriculture, that is a bit different. And this is where we see it. Should the canal situation persist or worsen, outbound bulk commodity exports can reflow around the logjam, albeit at a higher cost in freight and time, in the same way global commodity trades have rerouted around Russian sanctions. LNG, LPG, bulk commodities come out of the U.S. Gulf Coast and they swing through the Panama Canal and head to Asia. We export a huge amount of bulk material, and this is where we're seeing it right now, particularly as it starts to head into winter. I know it's sweltering hot right now around the United States and around a lot of the places, but as we start looking at winter, this is going to be a big problem if those levels of the canal don't rise. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our second story. So let's take a look at the container sector. And the container sector is really showing us a very interesting story right now. Series of stories from a variety of places that talk about what the container volumes look like. So here, Mike Schuller over at G Captain, Port of Los Angeles cargo volumes fall 27% in July. Port of Houston has the busiest July on record as peers disappoint. Port of Long Beach expects modest peak shipping season. Port of Savannah, container ro-ro volumes gain in July, and container volumes grow in July for South Carolina ports. So, West Coast is down based on LA and Long Beach, but meanwhile, Houston, South Carolina, Georgia, and other Gulf and East Coast ports are still seeing increases, which means what's going on in the container sector? Well, here, Mike Schuller at G Captain, supply chain hopeful of container market rebound, surveys show. Everybody's hoping that we're seeing a rebound come in. Is that true? If you look at some of the data coming out of container shipments out of China, we're seeing a decrease in that, so it may not be what we think it is. We're also seeing this from Lodestar over at GCaptain, more blank sailings and rate increases for transatlantic shipping. We saw the transatlantic rates really take a dive, but now shippers are canceling routes. When you blank a sail, that means you cancel a scheduled ship. And what you're doing is piling cargo higher on other ships, and you are artificially inflating the rates. And that's what's being done. The most disturbing story I saw this whole week on this has to be this one from Reuters over at GCaptain. Major U.S. retailers returning to just-in-time supply chain. All right, time out. Did we not learn anything from the supply chain crisis? We're returning back to just-in-time. And what just-in-time is basically is you are moving cargo. Cargo is consistently moving through the system, and there's very minimal time where cargo sits in any one place, either ship, port, warehouse, distribution center. That's it. The idea is the cargo is always kind of seamlessly moving. If you're in the retail business, the goal of retail is very simple. You want to bring commodities in the back of the store and send them out the front of the store with very little time on the shelves. Longer something sits on the shelf, less money you make. Same thing in freight. You want to keep the cargo moving. And just in time, which is a system that came out of Toyota and the Japanese, has been used extensively. However, one of the things we know with just-in-time logistics is it's very susceptible to disruptions. When you disrupt the chain, you cause havoc among the supply chain. A lot of people are going to go back to this system because it's cheaper for them. They don't have to spend as much money on storage, on maintaining huge inventories. It's much easier to get everything moving across. And that means that the supply chain has vulnerabilities. And when you have vulnerabilities, all you need is that black swan event to happen, and all of a sudden the supply chain gets disrupted. And that seems to be where we're going with this. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 3. Story number 3, I want to deal with 2 wildfires that are impacting shipping. So I'm doing a whole other story on this, a full one that you'll see later this week on what happened in Maui, a huge tragedy that befell the island of Maui. But right now what we're seeing is a shift in Maui toward this focus on the environmental impacts on the storm. What I am going to talk about in a much larger video later on is the impact of Maui, Matson lines, and the Jones Act. Because a lot of people are making this argument right now that supplies are not getting into Maui because of the U.S. Merchant Marine Act of 1920, Section 27, known as the Jones Act, which requires only U.S. goods to be hauled on U.S. flagged, U.S. built, U.S. owned, and U.S. crewed vessels. And let me be clear, it is utter bullshit. It is. I'm sorry, it is. There's cargo flowing into Hawaii faster than ever before because of the dedicated service. Is cargo shipping on American ships more expensive? Yes, because it's Americans. It just is. Higher standard of living. But one of the things that's being missed here is how instrumental it is to have an infrastructure like a company like Matson Lines on the ground in Maui, in Oahu, and a system in place where they can move goods and actually accelerate it. That is helping Maui a lot. I'm going to go into more detail in a subsequent video on this, so be tuned for that. But the other story has to happen in Turkey. A wildfire actually shut down the Turkish Straits. This is the waterway that separates Europe from Asia. This is the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. This is the area right now that's controlled by Turkey that is preventing Russia and Ukraine from getting military vessels through due to the Montreux Convention. And what we're seeing is a wildfire that's taking place and shutting down the main shipping line because of fear of smoke coming across, blocking people's vision and actually obstructing the operation of vessels. That's how serious this is. I am not talking about global warming. I am not talking about any of that stuff. I am talking about that this is happening and this is the impact that's happening. And what we're seeing is a lot more of this taking place around the world. Take you over to Splash 24/7, Bohan Lepek, becoming one of my favorite writers, by the way. I'm really enjoying what he is writing about. He gets very wonky on topics on shipping that I enjoy a lot. Why shipping should be worried about soaring ocean temperatures. You can make arguments all you want about everything, but it's clear from the data that ocean temperatures are rising. we're seeing that. And that issue is going to create disruptions across the globe. We're going to see more dynamic storms on the world's ocean. It actually impacts ship operations because if you don't have cool water to operate in your ship, it does change things like fuel efficiency and the safe operating. If you're using warmer water than colder water, that does have impacts. And it also will start changing ocean currents because, believe it or not, ships use ocean currents all the time. The Gulf Stream is a huge saver when you're going across the Atlantic. Same thing with the Pacific Current when you're coming from Asia to the United States. And so all of these issues are having an impact, and you have to look at it. Just did a video the other day on using sail power to supplement a bulker. Well, guess what? When you start changing ocean temperatures, you start changing wind patterns, and all of that plays into this. And I think it's very important. Ocean, mariners, as a mariner myself, I took meteorology classes because you have to understand wind, weather. You have to understand the dynamics of that because it does impact your operations. It's not a sailboat, a modern container ship, but it has a huge sail area, and it is impacted by the wind. And this is such a critical issue right now. We're seeing environmental issues playing a role on shipping. They always have. This is not new. But what we're seeing is the impact they're having is perhaps even more severe now than they have in the past. And with this wildfire in Turkey, with the massive wildfire in Maui that burnt out Lahaina, and now this issue with the increase in global temperature of the world's oceans, this is all impacting our ability to effectively move goods around the planet. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 4. So story number 4 is going to deal with bulk commodities, oil and coal, but really focused on what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And we've learned many lessons this week from Russia and Ukraine. Number 1, if you try to overthrow Vladimir Putin, don't take a plane. Don't fly a plane anywhere near his air defense. Pretty clear that Putin killed that dude with his surface-to-air missile. And why he was flying in and around Moscow, I don't know. If you try to overthrow Vladimir Putin, probably a good idea to leave country. Either overthrow him or leave. That's the lesson learned here. However, on the bulk front, we are seeing, obviously, some critical issues. This Bloomberg story over in G-Captain, a third of Ukraine crop exports wiped out after the Black Sea blockade. And again, this is going to be a big issue. We're seeing this happen. This has to do with the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the fact that Ukraine cannot export grain out of the Black Sea via their main ports in and around Odessa. I know, yes, we're using those little ports down Izmail and Remy on the Danube. And Sal, you can rail it, you can truck it. You can't replace a 50,000-ton bulk carrier with trucks, with rail, and even with small bulkers. Because, listen, you can get 50,000 tons of grain out of Ukraine by truck or rail, but you still got to load it on a ship at some point and sail it. So this is creating a massive problem. And more importantly, we're seeing the increase in freight rates. Some companies are beginning to back off. We're seeing the escalation on the Black Sea. Talked about this also in a previous video where we talked about how the Black Sea is morphing into what looks like the tanker war of the 1980s. And by the way, can I be clear? Financial Times use that exact analogy. They obviously are watching What the Ship. But we're seeing this happen. What means is we're not going to see shortages in food worldwide, but understand when, again, the next supply chain disruption happens and all of a sudden we can't get grain out of Canada because there's a strike or the Fraser River washes out a bridge or container companies don't want to take American exports on the West Coast because they want to prioritize empty containers or low river levels are impacting grain coming out of the Rhine or out of South America. Then all of a sudden that missing food coming out of Ukraine and Russia becomes extremely important. And we're seeing this time and time again in these level of disruptions. Add to it, Ukraine may use new Black Sea route for grain shipments. We just saw a container ship leave the port of Odessa, evade out. I've had people sitting there telling me, well, of course, Sal, they're not going to attack that container ship. That's a Hong Kong flagged container ship chartered by a Chinese company. Well, the ship's been sitting there since February of 2022. And if you look at the track line of that vessel, it followed the entire coastwise within the territorial waters of Romania and Bulgaria to get down to Turkey. So obviously, even the Chinese are a little worried about what the Russians are going to do. Russian bulk exports surged despite Western pressure. Russia is overcoming all the financial impediments and exertions being done by the G7 and the EU. Even though we see oil and diesel over the price caps, it's being shipped. And more importantly, we're seeing grain. There was a great story out this week that was done with a variety of groups. I'm going to do a separate video on this one too, talking about how Russia is shipping out Ukrainian grain on board their vessels through this very circuitous route to get it out. They're masking ships' AIS transponders. They're bringing it out of Sevastopol in the Crimea through areas in and around the Kerch Strait, moving it out. This was Lloyd's List and a few other companies tracking this, that we saw this happen. It is absolutely important to understand this. This is that story over at Lloyd's List. Bridget Dykon, fantastic story. Read this story, really well done. Tracks this investigation by Scripps News, by Bellingcat, looking at how the Russians are taking out Ukrainian grain on board ships and dispersing it around the world. Really well done. We're also seeing Russian seaborne crude flows, which are dropping. It's at the lowest since January, but that's probably more to do with energy consumption and not really so much to do with efforts to curtail the shipping at this point. Same time, we're seeing Europeans' gas surges on Australian LNG talks and Norway outages. LNG is going to be the commodity to watch this fall and into the winter. LNG was absolutely essential for Europe to get over the boycott of energy coming out of Russia, but it was a mild winter. More importantly, China and South Korea and Japan released some LNG shipments so that they can go to Europe. But what we're seeing is a shortage of LNG carriers. LNG charter rates are through the roof right now. And more importantly, if you can't get LNG out of the U.S. East Coast through the Panama Canal, that's going to be a big problem. That is going to be a big problem that's going to materialize going over. And as this Bloomberg story talks about, the LNG shipping rally is already off to an early start. In the meantime, we're seeing Iran uptick its oil exports. Ship trackers reveal that Iran's surging their oil exports. We're seeing more and more of that being done. We're finally seeing that oil being offloaded off the Suez Rajan, the tanker the U.S. seized. But at the same time, there is concern about what Iran's going to do in the Persian Gulf. One of the reasons why you see this happening is this oil comes off the Suez Rajan. In Houston, you see stories about the U.S. upping its protection. And then this story from Greg Miller, there's more coal being shipped by sea than ever before. Again, we're talking about clean energy, green energy all the time, yet people are using coal in a way that we really haven't seen before. And when you get down and look at this story that Greg has here, you really begin to see what's happening. And in particularly go back to the earlier story in the Panama Canal, this is impacting rates in a way we hadn't seen before. Because of the delays to get through the canal, coal is going up, and coal is being consumed by a lot of people. One of the biggest users of coal is countries like Germany, for example, use a huge amount of coal to energy produce. Got away from nuclear, but now they got to go back to LNG and coal to do it. All of these things are impacting. And when you look at all those stories together, you begin to get a better picture of what's going on in the world. All right, so go ahead and head to our last story. So for story number 5, who rules the waves? So I love to use a book in my classes by Bruce Jones, To Rule the Waves, How Control of the World's Oceans Shape the Fate of the Superpowers. Remember, I got it on my bookshelf right back up there. Bruce's book is fantastic. I think it's a great primer for my students to understand. And one of the things that Bruce talks about in this book is really how, post World War II, the oceans became a free seas. It really was, that the idea of freedom of the seas was fully embraced and nations could trade. It's one of the reasons why you saw the proliferation of these open registries, Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands. Prior to that, you needed navies to protect your shipping. Well, you don't need that anymore because the seas are fairly open and free. However, one of the things we're going back to is the idea of contested seas, challenges in the sea. And a series of stories this week really highlighted it to a point that I really hadn't thought about, that this is going to be a true thing. So South China Sea, for example. Philippines is working to resupply a ship that is beached on a reef out there. And this ship has a very interesting history for me, because this is the former U.S. Navy vessel USS Harnett County. That's the county I live in, North Carolina. The ship was used as an LST in World War II. It was used as a mothership for watercraft during the Vietnam War. It was turned over to the Philippines afterwards, and now it's beached. It is in horrible condition. You can literally drive through the ship with the holes that's in it. However, this ship is there with this detachment of sailors and Marines on board to exert Philippines control over that water. However, the Chinese harass shipments heading out there. And the Filipino president has said that he has made no promise to China to remove this grounded warship. Matter of fact, there's talk about putting another ship out there to continue that claim. And so this has to do with disputed land and seas out in the South China Sea. The Philippines and China actually went to the World Court to get this heard out under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. The Philippines won the case, but it doesn't mean that China abides by it. And what we're seeing is this growing tension. We actually saw standoffs between the Chinese Coast Guard, the Filipino Coast Guard. We saw the Chinese Coast Guard fire water cannons at resupply vessels, actually hit them with the water cannons. And let me be clear, these are not water pistols. These are not super soakers. These are high-pressure hoses shooting massive amounts of water at very small vessels that could hurt, kill, or potentially damage or capsize vessels if it hits. So these are shots across the bow by the Chinese against the Philippines. And what we're seeing again here is that there's no clear winner in this contest between the Philippines, China, and even the U.S. And we're seeing this issue between China exerting control and dominance over certain sea lanes, particularly those sea lanes that it deems as necessary for their transportation. I don't think China is trying to become a hegemonic power and take over the world. What they're trying to do is ensure that their sea lanes that move their imports and exports are protected and cannot be strangled, because China has in its head this image from the 1930s and 40s when China was cut off from the outside world by the Japanese. If you look at World War II, and I don't mean World War II, United States, Pearl Harbor attack, I don't even mean World War II European version, 1939, Germany invades Poland. I'm talking about World War II, Japan invades China, 1937. Japan unleashed a systematic campaign to cut China off from the outside world by securing ports, by cutting off routes, invading French Indochina, what is modern-day northern Vietnam and Laos, by cutting the Burma Road, by doing everything they could to isolate them. And then China watched what happened to Japan in World War II under Operation Strangulation when Operation Starvation, when basically the islands were cut off. And China is very cognizant of that. At the same time, you see countries developing new routes. Russia shipping naphtha to China via the North Sea route. They are not going through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Suez, the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea. They're using a route that's completely within their control, and that is that Northeast Passage along the northern shore of Russia, through the Bering Sea, through the Bering Strait, through the Aleutians, right to China. And this is probably demonstrated by China exercising some control. We saw that during the trip of the U.S. Vice President to Taiwan, China exercised a series of drills. We see these happen all the time in and around Taiwan. We see them close to undersea cables. We see them really putting Taiwan, surrounding Taiwan, with the ability to cut Taiwan off both by communications, by the air, and potentially by the sea. These are being demonstrated by China on a fairly routine basis. Now, let me be clear. The U.S. does the same exact thing. I mean, we all do this. But it's the tone, the tempo, and really the issues between the sides are the tension is ratcheting up, I would argue. And while everybody does this, it seems to be happening a lot more, with a lot more intensity and a lot more focus. So much so that you saw a joint Chinese-Russian warship group sail around Japan into U.S. waters off the Aleutians in Alaska and then back. And these joint Russian-Chinese task forces have garnered a lot of attention. There was an 11-ship task force off the Aleutians. The U.S. sortied 4 destroyers to follow them. But in many ways, how do you blame the Russians and Chinese for doing this when we send ships through international waters ourselves, very close to China and Russia, in the Baltic, through the Taiwan Straits? We don't do the Black Sea because, again, we've stopped doing that because of Russia-Ukraine war, and we don't want to ask Turkey to allow us to transit through for fear they say no. But this is the kind of escalation we're seeing. We're seeing the U.S. Sending out warnings to shipping companies. You saw this warning to avoid Iranian waters. I don't know how you sail through the Straits of Hormuz and avoid Iranian waters. There's a very narrow area there. You can't help but get close to Iranian waters. But we're seeing this tension coming up. But at the same time, the U.S. is really reeling under decisions made 20, 30 years ago in ill-fated building programs. The U.S. just decommissioned a ship that it just commissioned 5 years ago, the USS Sioux City, one of the littoral combat ships of the Freedom class. These are plagued vessels with machinery problems and they're combining gear. But, I mean, you heard the city council of Sioux City being really upset because they put out the, no stops in the commissioning of this vessel to commemorate it, and then 5 years later it's being laid up. And the U.S. Navy is screaming at the same time for more ships, more platforms, while they're decommissioning vessels. Granted, LCS is probably limited utility in a peer-to-peer conflict with a nation like China, but it could perform other missions, and there may be missions drone, underwater, under air, above air, surface drones that can be fitted to these vessels. There's a lot of things that can be done. And it takes me back to Bruce Jones's book, because Bruce really makes that warning in the book that are we returning to a period where the seas are once again being contested, which means, okay, we have to have navies that can go out and ensure the freedom of the seas for not just everybody's ships, but our own ships. You saw the U.S. talking about putting armed guards on board foreign flag ships, did a whole video on that. What does this mean going forward to protect ships from Iran, for example? The U.S. seems to be coming back into a period, along with the rest of the world, where there may be attempts to do this. Just watch the Republican debate the other night. And one of the things that Governor DeSantis of Florida talked about is maybe we will interdict ships through maritime operations going into Mexico carrying fentanyl. I don't know what that entails. Are we going to stop commercial ships heading into Mexico? Are we going to put people on the ground in Mexico to help inspect containers coming off them through the CBP, the Custom and Border Protection? There's a lot of things that seem to be happening around the world that are all ocean and shipping related. And hopefully I did a good job today in bringing them all together. I may have just confused the crap out of everybody. I hope I didn't, but I hope I gave you some context to what's going on in the world today. If you enjoyed today's video, hey, first off, subscribe. Why are you not subscribing to this channel? Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Hit the button so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. And if you can, support the page. How do you support the page? You hit the super thanks button down below where you can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon. Become a monthly, yearly subscriber. That's what allows me to do this and keep this type of information, news, entertainment, and great Hawaiian shirts coming to you. Until the next episode, Sal signing off.